So welcome to the first of the seminars from the biological sciences at Krea University. We're delighted that all of you are here and cannot tell you how delighted we are that it's being kicked off and started by Abishek Harihar, Dr. Abishek Harihar. So formally, he is the Deputy Director of Panthera's Tiger Program, and he trained at the Darwin Institute, right? At the University of Kent in Canterbury. And as he says, understanding the status of tigers and ecological and socio-economic correlates of their recurrence and persistence across the Western Terai Arc landscape, northern India. Before that, he was at the Wildlife Institute of India, where he did his master's. Before that, at the Madras Christian College for his bachelor's through the Madras University, and has extraordinary interest, not just in tigers, but also looks at one paper which found an endangered population of hog deer, was that it? Axis porcinus, and papers on birds, and remarkable naturalist in many ways. But there's another story, and that's a story of a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old boy who I knew when I was 19 or 20, coming out bird watching on the campus of the Madras Christian College, along with his aunt, one of my closest friends. And I saw that boy grow to join the Madras Christian College and go on to wonderful things at the Wildlife Institute of India, meeting him along the way in India, and later when he was doing his PhD in England, and watching on with the most extraordinary pride. And it gives me such joy that you are here, Abhi. So here's to you, and we all look forward very much to what you have to share with us. Dr. Abishek Harihar.
Thank you, John. Thanks a lot for that really personal introduction. I'd also like to thank Dr. Rangarajan for starting the conversation off and having me here today as well. So I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah, so I'll start right now. So what I'm going to talk about today is what it is to monitor tigers and going from the science to the politics of tiger and tiger recovery. So I want to start with this amazing photograph, and James is here today, and this photo was taken in 1920s by F.W. Champion, and what actually stands out in this is, of course, it's an amazing photograph, but human fascination with tigers, for instance. So we've always been fascinated by large carnivores, large cats especially, and it's amazing how even when we had the first possibility of using a remote camera to take a photo of anything, someone chose to take a photo of a tiger in the wild. So it kind of shows how we love tigers so much, and tigers are a part of so much of the culture and history, human history. So what I kind of want to impress upon is tigers used to be present across a vast area across Asia. This is at the turn of the century, or maybe around early 1900s. Tigers were pretty much present across most of Asia. But in recent years, and more specifically after about 1850s, the tiger numbers and tiger range shrank significantly in many places, and we are now down to about 6% of the historic habitat that tigers used to live in. So tigers are present in just about these patches that you see here. But what's more worrying is even within these patches, there are these dots of populations that hold about 70% of the known tiger population. So you can see already that tigers are restricted to literally dots on the map. So this kind of makes for two things: one, halting further declines if we want to save tigers, and making recovering tiger populations a major priority for global conservation. So given this, there was a commitment made in 2010. So in 2010, it was a one-of-a-kind one-of-a-kind meeting that happened where the 13 range countries that where tigers are present came together and committed to not just halting the decline of tigers, but also recovering tigers. But the but the commitment that was made was quite interesting. The commitment was to double tiger numbers in a 12-year span. And of course, there's a lot of interesting information around that, which is 2010 was a year of the tiger, according to the Chinese calendar. And 2022, which is the year coming now, is the next year of the tiger after a 12-year gap. So it was a really catchy commitment to double tiger numbers by 2022, between two Chinese years of tigers. So in 2010, the global estimate was, kind of agreed upon to be 3,200. We didn't really have a great estimate at that point. And we committed to increasing tiger numbers to about 6,400 by 2022. Now, what does that mean, in terms of population growth? So if you were to take a standard population growth equation, what you'd expect is, this growth rate, what you see here is lambda, to be a certain value to be able to reach the 6,400 in 12 years. And that, if you kind of solve it, comes up to be an annual increase of about 6%. So 6% annual growth doesn't sound like a large number, but for most populations, it does end up being a large number. So a question that's kind of thrown at us at this stage is 6% annual increase really possible? And what facilitates such growth? Where can it happen? And how do we reliably measure this kind of change? So a good thing about tigers is that they're quite easy to estimate populations. If you put out camera traps in the forest, you tend to get photos of tigers relatively easily. If you put them on the right trails and you know how to place them. And because tigers are striped and they can be individually identified, you can tell one individual from the other and use population statistics to estimate tiger numbers. So that makes tiger estimation really easy. Now, because it's easy to estimate tiger numbers, researchers and conservationists across the globe have gone around putting cameras in many of the tiger forests and estimated numbers. And this is, as I show here, about 300 sites that have been camera trapped, and we've got decent tiger density estimates for all of these places. But if you look at what we actually need to know, which is, how are populations faring? Are they actually growing? Are they changing? The trend data on tigers comes from a very small bunch of sites, a handful of sites. And these are some sites that have reliable estimates. So as you can see here, it's just about literally 6 that I've highlighted here, but there are a few more that have some trend information as well. And if you look at growth rates as well, they're not going to be static. They're not going to, tigers are not like viruses or bacteria. They don't grow exponentially. They kind of do taper off at a certain carrying capacity. So as a population reaches that carrying capacity, the rates of growth tend to slow down. And as you can see here, the rates of growth from a population in Russia that's been monitored for several decades actually shows that there was a steep rise, fast increase in tigers in the early years, but then as it reached carrying capacities between 1997 and 2007, you can see growth rates are slowing down. So the lambda here is about 1%, 1.7%. But also what's frightening is just one change in the way the situation is can really cause sharp declines. And you can see here between 2007 or 2008, actually, sorry, between 2008 and 2011, you see a really precipitous decline of tigers. And of course, I'm not going to go into the reasons why, but that's how quickly things can turn the tide with tigers. So what facilitates population growth? So when you look at populations, there are reasons why they grow. And as I said, we saw in the first section over here between 1966 and 75, something happened right, and that allowed tigers to grow. So to kind of explain what facilitates population growth amongst tigers, I'm going to take you to a site that I have spent a lot of time in, and that's Rajaji National Park in northwestern India in the state of Uttarakhand. So when I was a master's student at the Wildlife Institute of India, I started this research, and then I carried it on for about 15 odd years since then. So just to give you a quick introduction to Rajaji, Rajaji is an interesting protected area. Right in the middle that you see here runs the Ganges, and then you have the holy town of Haridwar and Rishikesh all on the banks right within this patch here. And you can see the protected area has two halves as such. So one is the western half over here, which I call zone 3. And then there's the eastern half, which is here, zone 1 and 2. So what's interesting about this setup is that it kind of gives us a quasi-natural experiment kind of setup to just see what happened to tigers under varying conditions of connectivity and human use. So just a little more background. In zone 1, there used to be a pastoralist community that used to live in zone 1, the Van Gujars. And in 2003, when I was doing my master's, there was a very large resettlement program, and the Gujars from the zone 1 were resettled out of the area. The same thing happened in zone 3. Gujars from zone 3 were also resettled out of the area. So these two blocks, zone 1 and 3, have no humans present within the forest. But zone 2, which is also, abutting zone 1, still had Gujars, and to this day still has Gujars residing within the park. What's also important to understand is the eastern part of the park is connected to Corbett Tiger Reserve. And many of you probably already have heard of Corbett Tiger Reserve. It's a really, really popular site with tourists, but it's also a great site for tigers. A lot of, there's been a very large population of tigers for a very long time. And that serves as a source for tigers to eastern Rajaji. Unfortunately, across the Ganges into the western part of the park, tigers are doing very poorly, and I'll get to this later. But one of the main reasons is this loss of connectivity between the east and the west. So just to give you a quick snapshot, the tigers in zone 1, during the time that I was there and monitoring them, they really kind of recovered really quickly. So we had tigers go from about 2 tigers per 100 square kilometers. That's the unit with which we measure tigers, going all the way to about 8 tigers per 100 square kilometers. And that's the carrying capacity that we had estimated given the prey densities that we knew from the site. And you can see that tigers are actually approaching that had approached that carrying capacity. In zone 2, as I said, again, it's connected to the Corbett National Park and the zone 1 as well in the eastern part of Rajaji. Tiger numbers, monitoring spanned a shorter period over there, but tiger numbers zoomed up really quickly very soon. So between 2011-12 and 2016, we had tigers actually more than doubling in zone 2. And in zone 3, where tigers were isolated in the western half of Rajaji, tiger numbers were very low, even though the carrying capacity was probably the highest amongst the 3 zones in Rajaji, and tiger densities were really, really low. So what makes zone 1 different from the others? In zone 1, when there were no people present, the pastoralists were not present in the park, what we saw was tiger numbers increasing, but what we also observed was individuals were actually surviving. So it was not just tigers coming in, being a part of the population and disappearing, but tigers were actually surviving. And more so, this was prominent and very visible with females. So females stayed longer, females were there longer, and if females stay longer, they tend to settle down, breed, raise cubs successfully, and they're able to contribute to the population. So just a kind of a quick example of what that is in Rajaji. So you have females that are breeding. This is a female we knew for many years, and she had cubs and she raised this litter successfully. And this is a very important metric if you were to look at how tigers are recovering, is to see how long females are surviving in a site, and also how successful they have been in breeding and contributing to the population growth. I'll just leave you with that. But if you look, but if you look at zone 2, which is the site where we also saw a rapid increase in tiger numbers, the story there is a little different. with Gujars still living there, also it's important for me to clarify, with the Gujars, they have livestock, so they're a pastoralist community, and conflict with tigers is quite, occurs quite often. So when that happens, individuals tend to be killed in retaliation, and that causes one of the primary results in mortality, and that's one of the primary causes of mortality for tigers. So because Gujars were still there and there were disturbances within the forest, what we saw was between zone 1 and zone 2, there was a big difference in survival. And this is overall survival, both males and females. You can see that in general, individuals didn't survive very long in zone 2. There were a lot of individuals coming into the patch, but they were really not staying. And this is kind of further, kind of highlighted by the per capita recruitment that you see, which is really high. A lot of individuals actually just coming in, probably spending a year or so and not really staying back. In fact, through the entire period, we only had one female that had bred 1 litter from our cam trap data. So you can see that, the multiple reasons why populations don't really recover very easily. So when you see this, recovery, and you know that it's not just about density increases, but there are also vital rates that are changing. So it's important to understand survival. It's important to understand recruitment within populations. But if you ask the question, where can such recoveries be supported? And, is there enough space within tiger range to have more tigers? The answer is actually an emphatic yes. There's a lot of space in tiger range, within current tiger range, that can hold more tigers. But we don't know if these conditions that facilitate recovery actually exist there. So in a few years ago, I was a consultant with WWF, and I did this study at that point. And we did a quick assessment of all of the TX2 program sites across the range. And these were 18 sites spread across most of tiger range. And what we identified in these sites was that they could hold way more tigers than they currently did. So we estimated at that point that those sites held about 165 tigers, but they had the potential to harbor at least 585. So that's a massive increase that can be supported, but probably such a recovery could not happen within 12 years. The time limits within which those kinds of recoveries could occur were much lower. And that was primarily because most of the sites needed prey recovery. 15 of 18 of those sites needed prey recovery, and that's a much slower process than tiger recovery can tend to catch up with. So, there is a lot of space for tigers, but probably not, the speed at which that can happen probably cannot happen within 12 years. So another question, of course, that we are left with is, okay, we know that tigers can recover and we know there's space to recover them, but can we actually measure this change reliably? And for this, I'm going to take you to a site that we've been working in Thailand. This is in Eastern Thailand, a site called Thaplan National Park and Pangsida. Sorry, the reference is a wrong one there. But over here, what we did was to show how important it is to get the design right. So a very important part of monitoring tigers is getting the design right. So in this particular site, what we did was to identify places where cameras can be placed based on field knowledge and where park rangers had gone around. And then we conducted a power analysis. So many of you who've used ecological designs and probably want to detect change would have heard of using power analysis to find out if your parameter is going to actually be sensitive to the changes that you want to see. So we ran these analyses, and then we actually found out that our design was good enough to be able to detect change. And then we went and set up cameras. So that helped us reliably estimate tiger densities at this site. And for those of you who are looking at these numbers, the estimated density at this site was half a tiger per 100 square kilometer. That's very, very low, right? So unfortunately, what happens in several tiger studies, and especially when it comes to national protocols for estimating tiger numbers or monitoring tigers, we tend to just use a single camera trapping protocol, which is place camera traps at 2-kilometer distances each, and then estimate tiger numbers. But often we don't even know if these designs are reliable enough to actually detect the change that we want to see. And therefore, it's important that, if we are going to say that we're doing well with tiger conservation, we also make sure that we're measuring impact properly. And that's a very important aspect of the work we do. So what does all of this have to do with global tiger recovery, and what are the implications for global tiger recovery? So one of the first things that we have to remind ourselves is in 2010, governments committed to increasing tiger numbers, and every country came up with an estimate and said, okay, here's how many tigers we currently have, and we think we can get to this number. So for instance, if you look at India, we committed to, we said we had 1,400 tigers at that point in time, and we said we could get up to 2,100 tigers. And that's a very reasonable 50% increase that we set up for ourselves. But if you followed the news, you'd notice that tigers have more than doubled. We're almost at we're at a state where we have the greatest population growth of tigers across the range, and we managed to achieve that 6% annual growth rate for our population, which sounds great because it really is a great recovery story if we have done this. But looking more closely at those numbers, there are a lot of reasons to believe that those numbers need to be scrutinized a lot more. So if you look at all of the estimates that we have, if you're familiar with 1411 tigers that we had earlier to 2,900 or tigers that we now have, a lot of things have also changed in the sampling. So between 2010 and 2018, there have been a lot of changes in the way we've done the work ourselves. So analytical methods have changed. We've gone from one analytical method to another analytical method. And without a cross-validation, we don't know how successful that change is. The other thing is the number of sites where we've camera trapped for tigers has more than doubled. So we've gone from 29 sites in 2010 to 141 sites. And just the addition of sites itself can obviously add more tigers. And that's the same when it comes to our sampling effort and number of cameras that we've placed out in site. And obviously, that's also resulted in more and more tigers being photographed because we've just gone to more places to photograph tigers. So these are things that we really have to keep in mind when we talk about tiger recovery, because very often, are we just shifting baselines or are we actually measuring a recovery? Now, some of the consequences of such increases can be quite dire, in the sense that India and Nepal, and in fact, this is also similar changes in sampling have also occurred in Nepal, for instance. But in India and Nepal, which supports over 60% of the world's tigers, such increases, especially if they're not really true population increases, but are sampling artifacts, can significantly affect the way tiger conservation goes forward. Falsely concluding that tiger numbers are increasing could affect funding, but it could also affect a shift in conservation status from endangered to vulnerable, when in reality the threats have not changed or the problems that exist on site have really not changed. The other consequence, of course, is India's, it's also possible that we get too bold and we are willing to help other countries, which is again great, which is not a problem, because I think there are several parts of the range that need support for tiger recovery. And obviously a country like India with about 70% of the world's tigers should do this. But as long as these are not based on false hope of making progress. But what we need to be doing is actually going beyond numbers. And this is where I feel that learning from the example that we had in Rajaji is a good chance for us to kind of look back. So we at Panthera right now, at all the sites that we're working in, we're making sure that we are not just tracking how densities are doing, but also looking at population growth. Are they actually growing? Survival, female tenures, and how many cubs, and several other vital parameters that actually tell us how good a population is doing or faring rather than just saying how many tigers there are at a site. So what we'd like to do in future, of course, this is a compilation that we've just done of some of the sites that have long-term data. But what we want to be able to do is to be able to look at tiger populations as moving estimates, as estimates that tell you how good populations are faring rather than how many tigers there are. And that would give us a better idea of how tigers are faring across the globe, and not just numbers. But to get to that, also, as I said, there've been a lot of problems with national tiger estimates, but it doesn't mean that any of these health metrics are not prone to similar manipulations. So a very important and crucial step in all of this is to also make sure that data is open to more people, to have more eyes scrutinize the data sets, and be able to actually contribute to conservation in a more fruitful way. So I'd like to end with this, and it's been lovely talking to all of you. So just leave you with a female tigress in Rajaji. Thank you. I'd like to thank a few more people, especially my field family from Rajaji, Imam, Amir, Bura, and Sher Singh, and Rajendra. Thanks.
Abhi?
Hello, sir.
When you talk about Rajaji, your zone 2, one important point you should mention is, the habitat available for tiger is very limited.
Yeah, that's true.
The flat area near the canal is very limited, flat, undulating, then the outer Himalayas start. Okay. So in such a habitat, when compared with the Chilla is much more broader and larger. You can't expect the tiger number to increase. Okay, villagers are also there. Okay. But this is a main problem actually. It's become very narrow towards Rishikesh, if you see, Okay. And closer to Binjrao and so on, that the Binjrao settlement is their big settlement. And in addition to the Gujas, the Binjrao is a big village there, that upper, so that point, I think you have to, when you talk about why the tiger number not bounced back in zone 2, you have mentioned that actually.
Sure. Thank you. I'll surely do that. Yeah, I agree. There is also limited area. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you, Abhi. Do you think you could possibly stop sharing your screen?
Yeah. So
then we can see what's happening. So thank you for that, Abhi. That was lovely. Could we take questions? And either way, you can put them in the chat box, or you can ask directly, preferably the latter, so we can actually have a discussion going. So, Mahesh asked, Dr. Mahesh Rangarajan, why do tiger numbers elicit so much controversy? In 1972 to 76, and again in 2005, there were a lot of questions on how the estimates were arrived at. You indicate the growth of numbers may be due to far more intensive and extensive reportage and better technology. So why are tiger numbers so important in the public arena?
That's a good question, and don't know if I'm going to do justice to that answer. But I think there are a lot of things that kind of govern why tiger numbers become so important. I think first is just public fascination and interest. That's one. The other thing is, I think in general we have this interest to want to count, which is a bit of a problem as well. And not really, so we end up just counting numbers and not necessarily understanding what's happening to those numbers. Those are two things. But I think the other thing is, I think in general, I think in the political conversation about conservation itself, we tend to pin a lot of hopes on what tigers can do. So tigers become like the central figure for telling us how well we are doing with all conservation in the country, or all conservation maybe in Asia itself. So I think tiger numbers, unfortunately, get kind of a lot of undue attention. Of course, what also adds to it is, different methods that have come along the way. And I think it was, started with people wanting to use pug.
We lost Abhi?
No.
give it a few minutes.
Where is Abhi? Hope is not in Rajaji, hiding among the bushes.
There's a lot of reason why that's, kind of stayed that way.
Abhi, we lost you for a while. So
Oh, I'm so sorry.
eliciting the comment that we hope that you weren't in Rajaji, but anyway, we know that you're in Bangalore. So
Okay.
could you possibly recapitulate the last few
Sorry.
sections
Yeah.
that you
So
said?
I think in general, I think the fact is we've pinned too much hopes on tigers as being the umbrella. And as a result, I think, every government, I think even governments and even, conservation NGOs have pinned a lot of hope on tiger numbers, trying to say that if tiger numbers are doing well, everything else is doing well in terms of, tiger numbers, and everything about forests are doing well, which I think is a bit of an illusion. And yeah, it shouldn't be looked at in a tiger-centric fashion. Yeah.
Thank you, Abhi. There are a few questions, but
Yeah.
Mr. James Campion had his hand up first. So if you can go ahead, Mr. Champion, and ask your question.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. Abhishek, I'm interested to know why the western part of Rajaji National Park is not able to support tigers. You mentioned it's because of the difficulty for them traveling from the eastern part because of the road and the railway and the canal. But I mean, I lived in the Netherlands for a long time. They don't have tigers there, but they do have an amazing system of what they call eco ducts, which are like elevated or subterranean passageways for animals to cross barriers such as motorways and railways. Is there any possibility of funding any sort of connectivity across between the two parts of Rajaji National Park?
Spend too much time talking about Rajaji. Maybe I should have as well. But yeah, Rajaji is quite interesting. Dr. Johnson is here, and he's been one of the persons who's for the past 30 or now probably even 35 years been giving recommendations to restore connectivity across eastern and western Rajaji. There've been a lot of studies, there've been a lot of reports written, and a lot of legal action as well. And so yeah, so the ideas to recover connectivity have always been there. So currently, the railway line, the road that runs through the corridor region has been elevated. And it's, I think as of now, it's functional as well. So that allows for the ducts below to act as connectivity, potential, space for connectivity. But unfortunately, I don't think we've still seen a tiger get across. That's how it is at this point in time. But it might just happen because there's been a lot of action of late with elephants moving across and things like that. But the thing with Western Rajaji is, if again, the best time to look at how connectivity looks for that landscape is if you look at the night light imagery. And if you look at the night lights around the region, it's just lit up, with a huge city of Haridwar just to the south of it, small cantonments and smaller cities to the north of where potentially, a tiger could walk across. It's just lit up. So I don't think we've seen a tiger really, cut through what they may think is a village and then get across. Although it's quite surprising because it's such a short stretch, but for some reason we've not had tigers move across from at least 2006 when I've been monitoring tigers there. But yeah, there are aqueducts, there are ducts that are all in place, probably just waiting for a tiger to get across. And now there's been a reintroduction program as well, so a supplementation program. So 2 tigers have been put into Western Rajaji, but we've still not seen any. Yeah, there's no confirmed evidence of breeding as yet. So
let me tell one important point, B.
Yeah, sure.
Tigers go up to the islands.
Yes.
And they come back to Chilla. Okay, because there's no cover in the islands. That's what I'm talking to the people here. We should create cover in the islands. Sambar go, Chittal go, they all come back. You would have seen it all crossing the Ganges and coming back. In the morning they come back to Chilla. If there is a cover there, I tell you, that's very, very important. If you want to naturally make tigers move to, western part of Rajaji, the cover should be there. So tigers stay there. When the tigers start breeding in the western part, if there is some call and so on, when the tigers come to know there are some females and so on, they will take off. Because fortunately the road, now it has been elevated. The road below that should be broken. I was told still people use the road below
Yeah,
the
it
elevated
is
road.
still used, yeah.
Immediately they should have broken the road below that. So you should facilitate the tiger by this way. You know, tigers cross Ganges, they go there to the island. Now we should make them to go to the other side. That will happen when the tiger number increases on the other side, and there is good cover on the Ganges. That's what I was suggesting to the people. Let us plant some castor plants. Castor plants, you know, is native to India. I'm native to that landscape actually. That can give excellent cover and perpetuate, that can perpetuate the cover also. And that is my suggestion actually. We should create cover in that islands.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Thanks.
Carrying on with the next question from JL. I don't know if the data isn't open, the methodology has changed from one survey to the next. How do we track tiger populations?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. And I think that really leaves us at the point where we've not been able to track tiger populations. So there are, you know, obviously, you know, data is also being collected by other organizations, and, you know, where available, you know, collaborations have helped understand how populations are actually faring. But in several cases, across at least a large part of, you know, sites where, you know, partners are not willing to share data, it is often, you know, it's often NGOs and governments alike. But those are places that we haven't been able to, you know, track. So yes, so the truth is, you know, we're living with a subset of the data set where we can say what's happening to tigers in the long term, but we're still, you know, we're just having to rely on, yeah, the analysis that's being put forth by other studies. Yeah.
We'll get to you, Satya. I'm just going to finish a couple of other questions. Thank you. From Snehadeep Kayat, how much of the tech space, advanced GPS trackers, dedicated apps, etc., involved in tiger conservation in the country?
Yeah, I think actually there's quite a lot. And frankly, not just in the country, but across tiger range as well. I think there's a lot of advances in tech space, especially trackers, dedicated apps. Then there are a lot of, you know, a lot of other surveillance that has come in as well. So, you know, and this is to, you know, counter threats that occur in the landscape, not just monitor tigers, but also, you know, counter threats. So there's a lot that's there, but there are also a lot of ethical issues around the use of technology. As long as, you know, the technology is being used to just monitor tigers and tell how well we're doing with tigers, I think we're fine. But you know, off late, there's been quite a bit of troubling use of technology in surveillance, trying to identify people, you know, things that are not accepted in public spaces, unfortunately, are turning out to be accepted within forest areas, and not just protected forest areas where legally at least there is a mandate for people not to be there, but even in non-protected forest areas, you know, surveillance and several other things have started to affect the way tiger conservation. So unfortunately, that does have a bit of a backlash on tiger conservation and tiger conservation organizations and governments as well. But at the end of it, I think, you know, as long as the technology is being used for protection and for monitoring how well tigers are doing, I think, you know, I think there's, yeah, there's been a lot of advances in recent years. So.
Thank you, Abhi. And
Abhi, I would like to
yes,
add one important point. You know, there's a very wrong notion, you know, the tiger is a flagship species. If it is doing well, other species are doing okay. It's not true. And what I find is in Bandipur, Nagargale, those areas, tiger number has gone up like anything, and the sambar number has declined very drastically. Because sambar is very vulnerable to tiger predation. Recently went on a 140-kilometer drive, and I saw only 5 sambar. In 76, 78, when I was doing my dole study there, one day 36 sambar were driven into the pond, I mean, by wild dogs. Wild dogs are there, they're also killing sambar, tiger leopards are there, and the tiger number has gone up. So sambar number has declined very drastically in that landscape, Mudumalai, Bandipur, Nagargale, because of the increase in the tiger population. I'm not accusing the tiger, that is bound to happen. And sambar is a very vulnerable species, and a wild dog also killed them. So we can't say that when the tiger number increases, everything is rosy in the forest area. It's not so.
Completely agree. Yeah.
Thank you again, Dr. Johnson. There is a fairly detailed message from Rajendra Garawad, the upshot of which is that it is wrong to say that tiger data is not open. Your thoughts, Abhi?
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm going to try and answer some of them. So I would say, yeah, I would say that I would disagree. I would say tiger data is not open to scientists for use. The fact of tiger data being open is not just being able to tell you which site has what. It's not data summaries that is useful to tell you how well we're doing, but actual raw data that tells you where individuals were captured, being able to use the true capture-recapture data that was generated from surveys be made available for people, for independent scientists to tell how things are going. So just kind of also touching on a few other points that I see on the comments here. Obviously methods have changed, and I would say from 2010 to now, methods are changing. Methods will change, and we will get better at doing the work we do. I mean, that's science at the end of it, in the sense that we will keep improving the way we do. But that also means us having to stop, go back to the historical data and recorrect our baselines if things have changed. So if a new method has come in, we should be either able to provide the cross-validation for how that method performs against the current one, or be able to say that, or be able to reanalyze the data and say, okay, here's the revised baseline from earlier. And again, there's a lot of conversation around that, but I would say at the end of it, the data is not truly open, and therefore such verifications are not possible by independent parties.
I'm going to, forgive me, Satya and Kalpita, I'm going to ask Mr. Rajendra if he's got the right of response over here for one question, and then we'll come back to Satya. But Ms. Rajendra Garawat, please. Rajendra,
yeah, my question is, the data, opening up of the data thing, I don't know. All our methodology is out there in the reports to say the entire thousands of tigers images are there in the volumes since 2010. We have shared what is possible. And then I think access to the data on case-to-case basis is always available. But making things, I would like to ask Dr. Hariharan has probably worked with the Dr. Ullas Karant. Ullas Karant did camera trapping since late 80s. Has he even given his data to the Karnataka Forest Department? No. Researchers themselves do not share their own data, and expecting the government to open up all the data is, I think, it has to be discussed. When the long-term monitoring data of the Western Ghat landscape in Karnataka is not shared with the Karnataka Forest Department, and here we want the data for the whole country. Is it for running again another propaganda? I'm sorry. The data can be shared on mutually agreed terms and conditions. Data is available for access, but then somebody has to come and sign the agreement and then look at the data.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I completely agree. I don't blame the government for not sharing data as well. And I think it's important to recognize that people who store data need to be open with their data sets for sharing. And so I think it's important again to highlight here that it's not about one group against another, nor is it the government versus non-government kind of a conversation over here. I think it's just the betterment of tiger science for data to be made available. And I think that's what I'd like to push for.
Thank you, Abhi, and thank you, Rajendra Garawat. I'm going to go actually to Shivani Jadeja's question because it deals directly with methodologies. And Dr. Jadeja asked, if details of methods are known, would it be possible statistically to modify estimates so they can become comparable, at least to some extent?
Yes, I think they can. So I think that's certainly possible. But again, I think with, at this stage, again, just coming back to, how the data has been collected as well matters to some extent. And especially with, again, I'm trying to look at some of the, sites that camera trapping has been done. There've also been changes in the way, the intensity of camera traps being placed or intensity of the sampling that's occurred. So there are several other minor changes which are not always fully reported on, that makes it difficult to identify or to be able to, truly compare. So I think we still are at a loss that way, in the sense that we don't have, we don't have all the information we need to be able to make those changes, to be able to make those comparisons.
Thank you, Avi. Dr. Kalpatha Paul asks, in India, there's artificial insemination for conserving tiger populations a common practice. To what extent is it used? So,
frankly speaking, tigers do well when it comes to breeding. They're not one of those species like cheetahs, for example, where the breeding biology of the species affects tiger recovery. So we don't use artificial insemination in the true conservation perspective as such. So that that's not. I think it's almost always natural growth. But that said, all what we really need for tigers to recover are places with good prey availability, and the right safe spaces to make sure that there's no human-caused mortality. So, frankly speaking, the biotechnology kind of interventions for tiger conservation don't really arise in most situations.
Thank you very much. Satya, could you please ask your question if that's all right?
Yeah, hi, thanks, John.
Of course.
Professor Harihar, mine is a very, very peripheral question, actually. It's more about the perception issues. And it is interesting to note, we even have now Bollywood flicks coming up with tiger-related themes, like movies like Sherni and all, which I think it's mostly inspired by the T1 incident at the Panthera. But there are also other questions on movies like that, like in terms of fictionalization. I mean, of course, it throws light on the challenges of forestry management and landscape management and all. But there are also a lot of goal arguments and kind of more in terms of fictionalization and all. I mean, as a conservator, what do you think, the kind of expositions like this, would it kind of mislead people, or would it add value to the question of conservation?
I think, again, I've not watched most of the movies, but I did watch Sherni, and I must say, actually, it does a really good job of kind of truly depicting what a forest officer goes through on site, with with multiple people pulling and pushing in different directions for a decision to be taken. I'm sure Dr. Rajendra Gawad here will have more to say about this, but I think there are several things, at least with Sherni, that was quite educated in terms of how difficult it is for the forest management to actually get involved in tiger conservation, because there are a lot of things pulling and pushing. The movie talks about mining, the movie talks about connectivity, the movie talks about a lot of things. And I think that's important for people to understand. Although, my frank opinion about the movie is I think they did a great job. But I think for a lay person watching it from outside, they might have found it different. So I've met a few people who, who are not connected to conservation. And when I tell them that I work on tigers, they said, oh, yeah, like the movie Sherni. But the first thing they also tell me after that is, yeah, that was a very boring movie. It wasn't like a regular Bollywood movie. So I think movies that are able to quite, tell a story well can help a lot, because I think there are a lot of very, important complexities that need to be communicated to the public. But again, there has been some sensationalization, especially when it comes to conflict. And unfortunately, conflict is a very difficult issue to deal with. And, so I would say, it's a tough tightrope to walk on. So
Thanks, Dr.
Thanks.
Thank you, Satya. Dr. Rajendra Garwat, do you still have a question? Your hand is up. I just wanted to check.
Yeah, no question. I don't know. The hand is not going down.
Okay. The students that are here, do you have any questions for Dr. Harihar? There are. If you want to think about it for a bit. Other members of the faculty? before it comes to me. So if there's anybody else. All right, Abhi, may I ask you a few questions? That's all right.
Yes, please.
Okay. Ecologically, where does is there a threshold above which the notion of a metapopulation no longer bears? I mean, you think about it a lot with butterflies and the like, but you think about source and sink populations. Does this at all function for large carnivores, for example, or mammals? Or if not, why not? Let's make that my first question, then we move on.
Sorry, but I'll have to ask you to repeat the last part again.
I said, is there a threshold?
Okay.
I mean, because you've got animals that move. So the whole notion of source and sink. And the reason I ask is there might be seemingly good habitat, and yet you don't find particular, members of a species there and others there are. Okay. So is that an example of a source and sink? And any thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, I think so. I think at least with tigers, again, I'll just kind of explain it in terms of tiger populations itself. So you know, if you look at tigers, and South Asia is a good example where structurally habitat is kind of makes you kind of realize where the sources and sinks are, because structurally, you know, there are some forests that can hold tigers, and they're literally forests that are probably not even forests, but you know, little slivers that can act as go-betweens, connectivity between populations. So that's you know, structurally that's how it is. But if you go to Southeast Asia, interestingly, there are lots of habitat, but you know, you still see populations centered around some places and not in other places. Of course, it could do a lot to do with the cultural landscape as well, because in general in India and South Asia, hunting across most of the landscapes and reduction of prey is not as bad as in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, there's a culture of hunting that's most forests, you know, you might probably have also heard this term empty forests or green deserts. Basically, you know, a lot of green cover, but no ungulate prey. But also the other thing to remember with tigers is, you know, they do rely on ungulate, biomass. And several of the wet tropical forests harbor much lower densities in general, naturally, of ungulates, than the tropical dry and deciduous kind of forests that we find in South Asia. So, you know, I think those are the reasons why, you know, populations or metapopulation structures kind of form with tigers. Although, you know, in Southeast Asia, you would expect that shouldn't happen. But I think that happens because, again, you know, it's kind of very dictated by protection and a protection landscape. So unfortunately, with tigers being so prized for their, body parts, the most direct threat to tigers is poaching. And the moment, you know, individuals get poached out, they really, you know, the populations really do collapse. So I think the structures, the metapopulations that are so visible right now are a combination of, threat to prey, threat to tigers themselves, and not necessarily, at least in Southeast Asia, not necessarily because of forest. But in South Asia, that is, you do have, you do have the structure that exists, and that's because of the forest cover mainly, and yeah, that's my quick answer. I'm so sorry. Yeah, hope that.
No job. Okay, my next ones, and these two will be related. One, I know I've spoken about relocation and in certain cases, and where you expect to see tiger populations where there's minimal disturbance and the like. So then, where do you stand in terms of the notion of fortress conservation? And from a Brockton perspective, that's one question. And okay, I'll move to the last one afterwards. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, again, I mean, frankly, I'm, I think the fortress conservation model has really affected communities very, very disproportionately. And I think, I don't think it's possible to talk about the fortress conservation model without bringing in, colonialism and how that's affected the way our relationship with forests has been. So I think that's a central part of the conversation. But that said, the fortress conservation model probably doesn't really, do good for the communities living around tigers. And there's probably a need for us to rethink the way we engage with communities in conservation, especially with tigers. But that said, I must also be very clear that there are some species like tigers that really do need undisturbed habitat patches where they can breed, where they can survive, and especially when poaching is such a significant threat to their populations, that undisturbed patch really makes a difference. So the metrics that I showed of survival, female tenure, long female tenures, all of these parameters really matter for a population of tigers. So having a safe space, or what is very easily termed photos conservation, does turn out to be the model that you want. You want some protected areas. So that's the way that is. But that said, it doesn't have to happen the way it is practiced right now. Right? So I think the vision is one thing, but then the practice is a different thing as well. You want some safe spaces, but you don't want them to be so cut away from anyone else. So that's, there are that way, to talk about it, there are legal structures within India, especially, that allow for, these models of conservation to be tried. And one of which is obviously the Forest Rights Act, the FRA. And if it's implemented well and used well, I think there are ways in which, alternate models of conservation with tigers and humans can be tried. But again, that comes back to what is the primary threat that the community faces, or what is the primary threat that the tiger faces in the presence of the community or in the presence of people. That needs to be clarified. So with Gujars, it was very clear. It was because they had livestock, and retaliatory killing really decreased tiger numbers. That was the mechanism through which tigers were being affected. But there could be another landscape where there isn't a threat, hypothetical landscape where there isn't a threat for tigers. And if that situation does exist, then you don't need a fortress conservation to make tigers work there. And a good example of that is Dibang in Arunachal, where the local taboos in cultural and socio-cultural taboos have helped tigers persist. A similar thing may be happening in BRT in Karnataka, where the Sholigas have been with tigers, and tiger densities are quite high as well. But such models may exist, but we need to understand them from how populations are performing again. And it comes back to the question, to the point that I was trying to make, is that we need to understand the health of the population. How good is a tiger population doing, and not just its numbers, but its survival estimates, its recruitments, and the tenure of females.
Thank you, Abhi. I'll come to my last question later because
Sure.
Professor Rangarajan and I need to have a couple of others. So Mahesh asks, Gir lions recovered from fewer than 200 in 1968 to 600 or even 800 now with range expansion. The tiger story 2020 has some parallels and significant differences. What are the similar factors? Are they at work at all? And how far is it due to policy or social, ecological, or cultural milieu?
Frankly, I'm not very sure, but I would kind of pin a lot of it to, I think, the targeted poaching that tiger populations have always gone through. Unlike tigers, lions have not had a significant poaching problem, and it was a single population that was protected and recovered quite well. But I think with tigers, the multiple populations we've had, frankly, have always been subjected to some amount of poaching. And even currently, even though, probably tigers are doing well in several patches, I think pretty much all populations across the globe are subjected to some amount of poaching. So recovery doesn't really, can happen as much as you'd expect it to. I think that's one of the things. In addition to that, I think, also the complexity of the socio-cultural context within each of the landscapes where tigers exist is also a complicated thing, because it's not as simple as just one landscape, say in Gujarat, where tigers have recovered. It's really, I think you'll have to go through it case by case to figure out why certain populations or certain landscapes have probably done better than others. I hope that answers something.
Abhi, I would like to add a very important point about the lion conservation. If lions are doing very well, I tell you, that is because it is in a vegetarian state. That's a very important point. Lot of cattle, lot of nilgai. The Muslims cannot shoot nilgai because the Hindus will protest. There are pigs also, even outside here, in the agricultural field. So enormous amount of prey is available in the form of livestock, nilgai, and and the wild pigs, and the lions are doing very well, and they become lazy also. Okay. So on the contrary, tigers, they wherever the people are poor and meat hungry, like our Rasa was talking about the empty forest, there the people are poor and they're meat hungry, and they will he said sambar has become extinct in many places. In there, and even for Sikkim, for example, there is no sambar now. Even in famous Arunachal Pradesh, sambar population will be very, very, very low. So when people are poor, when they're meat hungry, very difficult to save the tiger. On the contrary, the lions, the people there they're not meat hungry. Remember that point. Very, very. It's a vegetarian state. I used to joke, that if Kerala people are living there, lions will not get enough to eat there because all the beef will be eaten by the Kerala people.
Point taken, Dr. Johnson. As a Malayali. But okay,
I can say that from the name itself.
Indeed. Yeah. The Anita Arjundas asked, and I know you've done work with Kriti, Avi, how do metrics fare for tigers outside protected areas?
Yeah, so I would say we don't really have too many sites that we've actually seen, with tigers outside protected areas. Frankly, I think that's one thing. Even at the sites that we do have some information, there are places where tigers are doing well. And, for instance, if you look at the Tarayak landscape, there are sugarcane fields that have tigers. We've known a few individuals that have survived there for a long time. We know of, a friend of mine monitors tigers in the region, and he's actually documented a female that's stayed and bred and raised cubs successfully in sugarcane plantations. So there is, a possibility that there are, a few individuals here and there probably still surviving and doing well. But in reality, I don't think we have enough information to say how well they're doing outside protected areas. Often outside protected areas, especially in India, often outside protected areas, they're already in a human or multi-use landscape where they're confronted with livestock very often, and conflict is a very serious problem. The best way to kind of see that is all of the high density tiger populations in India have also the highest cases of conflict. So Corbett has about 1,000 livestock loss is a year. Places like Kana, Bandhavgarh, all of them have very, very high livestock losses. So although we don't really have an idea about how those populations are doing if there are outside, but obviously we do know that retaliatory killing does affect several of those individuals.
The sugarcane, I'm sorry, sugarcane plantations, since they are very close to the forested landscape, tigers are able to survive there. If you have an isolated sugarcane plantation far away from the forest, tigers won't be able to survive there. That's a very important point one has to remember, actually.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Then we do have one student question from Aditi Balaji. Are there any implications of improper use of the FRA in tiger conservation?
I think yes, for sure. And I think that, obviously it depends on how rights are settled. That's a very important part of the FRA process. And I think if those processes are not followed true to the spirit of how the law is set up, I think there are potential ways in which you could have negative implications for tigers, and I do feel that is potential. But again, the number of successful FRA implementations within tiger protected areas is still not as many for us to really see what's happening. So yeah, I would say we have fewer cases to be able to evaluate at this point.
Thank you. Aditi continues by asking, are there differences in tiger population in protected areas that allow for tourism and those that don't?
I don't think so. I think at the very base, the problem is just what kind of habitat supports tigers. It's just an ecological function. There are some habitats that tend to support more ungulates and have higher ungulate densities and therefore support tigers. So I think that I think that's basically what it is. And tourism is kind of on top of it. Where people start seeing tigers more often, tourism kind of increases there. So I think it ends up, at least tiger tourism ends up following tigers rather than tourism creating conditions for tigers. That would be my understanding of it. And also for many of the tiger reserves, and this is something that I did when I was in Uttarakhand. We looked at tiger images that were, given to us by tourists, and just a few of those tourist roads where you get tiger images. It's interesting, but it's just a repeated number of the same individuals. So some 10-15 individuals every year are the tourist tigers, and then there are about 95 other individuals that are living in the same place, which don't surprisingly get clicked, by tourist, people, or the tourists don't take photographs of. So yeah, so I think I would say that first of all, I mean, tourist tigers are very small bunch. Of course, there are some protected areas like Ranthambore, where pretty much I would think that every tiger is probably exposed to tourism. But I think in most other protected areas, Kana, Bandhavgarh, I would still expect that the fraction of tigers that are exposed to tourism is smaller.
Habituated tigers and non-habituated tigers. That is the way we should define them actually. Yeah. Habituated to the tourists, habituated to the vehicles.
Well, the cat thing. Aditi, you wanted to follow up on that? You have your hand up?
Yes, I did. I figured it would be easier to ask rather than type it out. Hi, thank you for the talk. I had a follow-up question to the tourism part. So in a lot of places, citizen science data is being used. So assuming that, I mean, what I infer from what you're saying about, getting only habituated tigers as pictures from tourists, would citizen science data have an opportunity like in the near future to kind of like contribute to research, or that's like very hard? Is that like a possibility?
Yeah, I would say quite hard, frankly, because the number of sites where tourism is able to actually, consistently pick up tigers is few. Even amongst all our tiger reserves, and even within them, those which sample, tourism samples a significant percent of the population is again few. In fact, several years ago, there was an initiative to use citizen science for tiger monitoring, but I don't think the initiative was very successful, again, just because of a similar situation where, the number of individuals that are probably photographed by tourists is much smaller. But that said, some individuals do also get major prominence. Like if you go to most tiger reserves, people will be calling tigers out by names, which is quite interesting because, especially you go to Ranthambore, everyone knows the name of a certain individual, and there's some famous tigers like Machli or something like that that have lived for a long time. It helps people connect. And I think it has a good, value in terms of connecting people to tiger conservation. But I think, beyond that, to be a population metric or population, monitoring tool, I don't think it has too much value. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thanks.
I think we're coming to the end. I'm gonna end with one last question, Abhi, and unless there's anybody else who's got anything to say. I know, and it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, I know you're with Panthera, but my question is going to deal with Asinonyx, but it's there's been this concerted effort to try and bring the cheetah back into India. What do you think first of all, do you think this is a good idea? And second, what are the implications for conservation more generally? Will the focus be taken off species like the tiger with something like this happening? What are your thoughts?
So I think it's a really good question, and I have different opinions about different parts of that question. So I think the first part of the question, if I were to kind of prioritize it, I would say, bringing cheetahs back to India, if the aim is to protect grasslands and to be a flagship for grasslands, then I don't think that it's going to serve that purpose. One, because we already have flagship species that already represent grasslands that should ideally be promoted. The Great Indian Bustard is doing so badly. It can be promoted. And there are government, there are government schemes that are, trying to protect the Great Indian Bustard for sure. But if that is the argument for having cheetahs come back, that I don't think it is completely justified, because you have Great Indian Bustards, you have wolves, and then you have black bucks as well, and all of them can be charismatic animals that can be used as flagships for bringing conservation measures into grasslands. So I think that's one thing. So I would say, cheetah doesn't really need to feature if that's the reason. The second thing is that the other thing that I would also add to it is that, if we are not being able to bring the Asiatic cheetah back into India, then we're really not doing much in terms of saving a certain subspecies either. Just bringing a African cheetah into India is not going to really change anything for the subspecies either. So I think, both in terms of the species and in terms of the habitats that they produce, they are supposed to kind of be a flagship for, I don't think they really match up. So I think that would be my, short answer to that. But again, as I kind of understand. Also, I see that Dr. Rangarajan has said that they're not only grasslands, they also other scrub jungles. I agree. But again, if it's habitat representation for scrub as well, it's again, we have several other species that can be flagship. So I would say, that, we probably cheetahs don't necessarily be the kind of flagship we need for that. The other thing that I would kind of, finally add is that I don't think it's going to take away attention from tigers for sure, but I just hope it doesn't take away the attention from other grassland species that are supposed to be there. And I think that's more important rather than, the focus on tigers. And I think that's, that's something that I would kind of caution in the sense that I think and also the other thing is very important thing to remember is I just hope that the cheetah reintroduction program is not a boutique program. It's not just bringing in cheetahs back into India to say that we have an additional cat species on our land, but it should actually be one that is able to establish a population, establish a functional population, probably a meta population as well, where they're actually doing the ecosystem service that they're supposed to do. So if our long-term vision for bringing back cheetahs is to ensure that, and I think that's good. I think that's worth it. But at this point in time, it's unclear what the long-term vision is. And if it is to be a flagship for grasslands, I don't think we're justified, especially because we have so many other potential flagships. And if it's supposed to be saving, the Asiatic cheetah, that particular subspecies, which is unique in its own way, then we're not doing justice to that either, because I think right now the proposal is to bring in African cheetahs.
The African cheetah, yeah, that's true.
Wonder, final thing. I mean, a lot of leopards. Maybe, they say there are more than 30 leopards. And what do you foresee actually, leopard and cheetah? Understand, cheetah is very often killed by leopards in Africa.
Exactly. Yeah, so I would say that as well. Yes, there are other biological interactions that need to be considered as well. And a place like Kuno was also at one point to be the second home of the lion, and that's where the process of relocation and all the recovery started. So if you're going to have lions and cheetahs back in the same place, then you're going to have the same conflict between those species that you see in Africa. And of course, leopards can be things. So yeah, so I think there are a lot of other things to consider. But I'd kind of go back to what you were mentioning, John, in the sense that if it depends on what the reason is to bring back cheetahs, and if it really is one where you want to restore grasslands, then I would say there are other flagships. And if you want to save the Asiatic cheetah, then I would say we're not bringing the right subspecies. So.
Well, on that note, wait, I'm just going to say, I was about to say goodbye to everyone, but there is an interesting question that I have, and I'm going to ask Aditi has sent me. Is there a possible reason why carnivores and predators are seen as more charismatic species and are hence made flagships, rather than birds and other herbivores like the black buck and the great Indian bustard? And we'll end with that.
That's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question. Frankly, I don't think I've read up all of the research that I know to answer that, but there's been a lot of research on what makes flagships. And frankly, there's been some really, really very, well thought out experiments using econometric models to identify flagship species. So, again, I'm not very familiar with that literature, but I know that the conversation about flagships has also changed from the initial idea of just being charismatic to actually having several other attributes and values. So I'll try and answer that question if I could get your email ID maybe, and then kind of direct you to those papers. But I don't want to step out of the literature that's actually there. And there is a growing body of literature, so I prefer pointing you towards that.
Well, I'll connect two of you. Abhi, thank you so much for being here. It's been such a joy having you and having you share your erudition with us in many ways and your experiences in the field at a personal level. Such a thrill. We thank every one of you for being here and for making it such a lively session. Take care and have a wonderful evening. If you're in Japan, Mr. Champion, a very good night. Yeah, take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thanks again, Dr. Rangarajan, for having me here.